Okay, everybody, here we go again. I know I'm not in a suit this time, but oh well. You won't have to look at my ugly mug the whole time during this thing. I'm just kind of playing around with the software, seeing how we can make this stuff work. Anyway, here's the last year lectures from the first week of class. Well, second week. Weird. This whole mastery thing gets hard to talk about. So anyway, this is the stuff that you should be testing on first, but it's technically the material from the second week of your course. So we'll be discussing this stuff during the second week. Anyway, conditioned reinforcement. Let's keep moving on. Primary reinforcers. Let's see. I'm drawing a complaint blank, even though I've got a slide up here. Isn't that great? Anyway, no, here we go. Unconditioned reinforcers. Basically what we have are, we consider these primary reinforcers. These are the things that you don't need to learn about. Okay, what I mean by that is that they work without any prior experience of the organism. And there's a little bit of a caveat to that. So let's look at some of these things here. So we got food right off the bat. We got water. That's another one that's really good. Sex, and I love my little picture there. I just think it's great. And then warmth, right? So those are really common unconditional reinforcers. They're pretty much the standard. But in order for food to be a reinforcer, I said earlier that these things work without any learning or any experience. It's not completely true. The idea is that for food to be a reinforcer, the organism must be deprived of that food. Okay, this should start making you think about those motivating operations, right? So to a hungry organism, food is a reinforcer. To a thirsty organism, water is a reinforcer. To most organisms, sex is a reinforcer. This one doesn't have to do much with deprivation. It's kind of an interesting reinforcer in that sense. And of course warmth. Just being warm is one of those really primary reinforcing things, getting all wrapped up in a blanket and that type of stuff. So again, no experience with those whatsoever. It's just the fact that you are a living organism, a person, and will make these reinforcers for you. So what we're going to do is we're going to build on these things. So those conditioned reinforcers are the primary thing that we have. Okay, so we're going to build on those by pairing neutral stimuli, okay, with those primary reinforcers. So neutral stimuli are things that you don't have any experience with, so to speak. So for example, I know this is rather contrived and a bit odd, but take a look. Okay, this little post-it note thing here could be a natural or a neutral stimulus. In fact, it is to most people. So it doesn't really mean anything. It's not a reinforcer unless we paired this repeatedly with food, or paired this with sex, or associated this with water. And association and pairing, I'm using those interchangeably here. Right? So by pairing neutral stimuli with primary reinforcers, you can develop conditioned or secondary reinforcers. Okay, so the neutral stimulus, this becomes a reinforcer, as it says up there, is paired with an unconditional stimulus. You guys should recognize this. This is classical conditioning, right? So neutral stimulus is paired with an unconditional stimulus. The unconditional stimulus is your primary reinforcer. So your food, your water, your sex, so on and so forth, right? And that will develop a conditioned reinforcer. Pretty straightforward. Some really simple examples of conditioned reinforcers over there on, I don't know if it's going to be on the right or the left of the video, but over here, you've got your little clicker, little thing you can use to reinforce animals with. The idea is that the click is not a signal for the animal what to do. The click is a signal when the animal has done something correctly, right? The click is a reinforcer. That's all there is to it, right? And we develop that reinforcer by going click, treat, click, treat, click, treat. Okay? The idea is that you use that that sound, that neutral stimulus, you turn that into a conditioned stimulus, but in reality that particular conditioned stimulus is a conditioned reinforcer, right? So we turn that conditioned stimulus into a conditioned reinforcer, or that neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned reinforcer, and that click sound itself will reinforce an animal's behavior because it basically means food, right? Money's the same thing. Money's like the best generalized reinforcer ever. Generalized condition reinforcer. Why? Because it gets you all those things. It gets you warmth, it gets you sex, it gets you water, it gets you food, it gets them all, right? So it's been paired with all those things. It's a special sort of reinforcer, and we'll talk about those here in a minute, why it's a special one. Clickers are another thing, or I'm sorry, we just went through clickers. Photos are another thing that are essentially conditioned reinforcers. This one's a bit tricky to think about, so take a moment and think about it. Pause me if you want, but the idea is that the question is, how can a photo be a conditioned reinforcer? Well, it's pretty simple. Okay? The photo is not the event. right? The photo, okay, is just a neutral stimulus. It so happens that you can remember the event, right? So likely. So if you've got a picture of a group of friends out camping or something like that, then the idea is that the unconditioned stimulus, the primary reinforcer, so to speak, is the experiences, those feelings that you had at the time of the photograph. And you compare that photograph now with your thoughts, your actions, and your feelings, right? So that photo can be a conditioned reinforcer. So pretty cool stuff. And it's been done with other than humans, by the way, so it's a pretty robust effect. The backup reinforcers, new term here that, again, your book covers it, but backup reinforcers are the ones that are essentially the primary reinforcers. So the neutral stimulus, when we develop that into a conditioned reinforcer, you pair that with the backup reinforcers, right? So, but every once in a while, and we use the term backup because every once in a while you still need to kind of back up your conditioned reinforcement with with some more of those natural reinforcers, right? So you present the conditioned reinforcement, and then later, on occasion, you present the backup. So once the clicker has turned into a reinforcing thing, you don't have to treat every single time anymore, but you still got to add treats every now and again. So it's click, treat, and then you can use clicker for a day or so, something like that. Maybe add a treat the next day, that sort of thing. So, and by the way, you can clicker train husbands too. There's a article on it out there if you guys want to go ahead and find that on the internet. It's out there about clicker training my husband. I think is the title of it, something like that. Tokens. All right, tokens are basically conditioned reinforcers, right? You earn all of these crazy tokens, and they don't mean anything until you turn them in for something, right? So you got the first couple of pictures there, the actual tokens that you might earn, and then you exchange those for the backup reinforcer. Right? Excuse me. The nice thing about token economies, or token systems, whatever you want to say. The nice thing about those is that the token can be delivered very fast. Okay, so it becomes a very powerful reinforcer. It's delivered immediate, and then we know that that's a good thing with reinforcement. And then later on, you exchange that for backup reinforcer. As you can see, they're pencils or little toys or whatever it may be. So, and we're going to talk a lot about token economies later in the quarter and about how you schedule them, schedule payouts and things like that. But there's all sorts of stuff that's related to this, but it all works off this principle of conditioned reinforcement. This one's pretty self-explanatory, right? So make sure that the backup reinforcer is actually a reinforcer. But so again, there's another thing that I'm kind of hemming and hawing about here. I haven't told you the whole story. The whole story is, I'll fill you in, right? So the rest of the story here is that you've got a conditioned, got those unconditioned reinforcers, right? Food, sex, water. Okay? And then those get paired with something. And that something, that neutral stimulus, becomes a conditioned reinforcer. You can also take that new conditioned reinforcer and pair it with another neutral stimulus and then get another conditioned reinforcer. It's called higher order conditioning. We do get that all the time with reinforcement. So there can be multiple levels of that. How many levels is still under question, but you can get at least 2 levels and possibly 3, depending on the research that you're referring to in the lab. So when I talk about making sure the backup reinforcer is actually a reinforcer, you have to keep in mind that we're also talking about the secondary and tertiary level of reinforcement, right? So degrees away from that primary reinforcer. So was it just that first degree away? That's your second. That's your conditioned reinforcement. Was it a second degree away? Was it something that was paired with a conditioned reinforcer? Well, that in itself is a secondary, higher order or secondary reinforcer, and then you've got the tertiary stuff. So the idea is that you need to make sure that whatever you're pairing this with is actually a reinforcer in order to develop a new one. And you don't know that until behavior changes. So, the food is always a good one to use because it's one of those unconditioned ones. It's for everybody. So as long as you deprive the person of food for a little while, make them a little bit hungry, then it's going to be a reinforcer. So that's a good one. Money is generally speaking a pretty good reinforcer. Not for everybody though. Some learners that have disabilities, they haven't learned the value of money. They haven't learned that you can exchange it and things like that. So that's one that you might want to think about as well. So, as you might have guessed, food is not a reinforcer to a satiated organism. If you're full, then it's not generally going to be a reinforcer. I like to think about using multiple backup reinforcers rather than just pairing it with one thing, that condition reinforcer, rather than just pairing it with one other source of reinforcement. Pair it with multiples, and then it becomes a generalized reinforcer. It connects to many things. So money is the classic example of a generalized reinforcer. It connects to everything, so it's a really powerful one. Here in a little bit, we're going to talk about intermittent reinforcement. It's still the best in terms of backup reinforcement. We'll talk about schedules of reinforcement, and you may have already read that in your book, so we'll just come back to that here in a little bit. Don't let the condition reinforcer extinguish. In other words, make sure you still pair that condition reinforcer with those backup reinforcers on occasion. You can't just let it, you can't just use it over and over and over and over and over and over and over again and expect it to be valuable. Okay, that it's going to lose its value. Eventually, you're going to have to pair it with that backup reinforcer. So this is what we talk about, the kind of the point before, saying that intermittent reinforcement is still best in terms of the backup reinforcement. So every now and again, you need to drop in that backup reinforcer, make sure those things get paired. That's like the clicker stuff, right? So the clicker itself will lose its value. It won't mean food after a certain amount of time unless you keep, on occasion, pairing it with that with the food. So it's about maintaining the strength of that condition reinforcer. As you might expect, there's problems, right? Make sure that the condition reinforcer actually leads to a backup reinforcer. If it doesn't, it's going to extinguish and it's going to lose its effectiveness. This is probably one of the more common things you're going to run into out in the field in terms of application of this stuff, because people go, oh, that was reinforcing behavior, I'm going to keep using that. And maybe it's something like the words, good job. Right? That's going to lose its effectiveness over time, right? Unless you pair that with something else. Okay? So you still need to do this other stuff. Okay? Punishment, believe it or not, when we talk about reducing behavior, has the same issue. Threats and things like that is what we're going to refer to here. Okay, the extinction problem that we talked about, make sure that you use effective backup reinforcers. If those backup reinforcers are not really reinforcers, then you're going to end up extinguishing the effects of the condition reinforcer. It gets a little awkward to talk about, but the condition reinforcer is no longer going to be a reinforcer unless you pair it with backup reinforcers once in a while. All right, we're going to come back a little bit and continue in the same video with the last chapter for this section. Okay, intermittent reinforcement. Here we go. This is, I can't remember what chapter we're working on now, but this is chapter on intermittent reinforcement. All right, let's move forward. So what we're looking at here is something that we call schedules of reinforcement. And the idea is that reinforcement can be scheduled at a particular rate. In other words, a rule of how frequently a behavior will be reinforced, if it's reinforced at all. This also includes things like how many times do you have to do the behavior, how long do you need to wait to do the behavior again to get a reinforcer again, and this is all the stuff that we covered in 324. Now, we can think about a continuous schedule of reinforcement, right? So a continuous schedule would be if you do something, then you get reinforced immediately for it, right? Think flipping on the light switch, right? You flip on the light switch, lights come on, right? So that's continuous schedule of reinforcement. Every time you flip the light switch, lights come on, or they go off depending on which ones how it's working, or which direction you're going. Soda machine, same sort of thing, all right? You put your money in, you get your soda out, right? Those actually don't maintain extremely high levels of responding. It seems like they do on the surface, but they're actually very weak schedules, and we'll talk about why they're weak here in a little bit. Right? So the ones that maintain the highest rates are intermittent. In other words, if you have to flip that light switch several times before the light comes on, that'll actually maintain more behavior. Think about how many times you have to actually flip the switch, and that's the type of behavior that it's maintaining, right? Casinos and things like that, they're all about these high rates of responding. How many times will you actually press that button, right? On the slot machine. So if every time you press that, then you think of that as one response. If it reinforced you a little bit every time, well, then at the moment it stopped reinforcing you, you'd walk away, right? But with an intermittent schedule of reinforcement, you never know when your payout's coming, right? So there's a lot of different types of these intermittent schedules, so let's go ahead and look at it. There you go. Cute little sound. Anyway, the ratio schedules. Ratio schedules are really straightforward. We've got two different types of ratio schedules. Number one, you have a fixed ratio schedule. Fixed ratio is dependent on the number of responses being performed. Right? So fixed ratio said if you had a fixed ratio 4, for example, you would have to make 4 responses before you received a reinforcer for those responses. And then you do 4 more and get a reinforcer, and 4 more and get a reinforcer. Right? They have a variable ratio schedule, which is where if we had a VR4, a variable ratio 4, you would have on average every 4 responses you'd get reinforced. Right? So that VR is going to maintain more behavior because you never know when the reinforcers are coming. FRs, right? So an FR produces this very interesting stepped effect, right? In other words, you start this ratio run, right? The moment you start responding, right? Then you finish your activity. Okay, that's called the ratio run. So if you have an FR4, you're basically going to be taking a break, doing nothing, and then you're going to start responding. Right? And you go, make your response 4 times, whatever that response is, and then you get reinforced for it, and then you're going to take a break. That break after reinforcement is called the post-reinforcer pause. Sometimes we call it a procrastination pause because whenever you start somebody on a schedule of reinforcement, on a fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement, they actually wait before they start responding. So in other words, there's a bit of procrastination. The take-home rule to this is if you're working on a paper or something like that. Papers are types of fixed ratios. If you think about it in terms of, you have to write a 5-page paper. That's basically 5 pages of responding that you need to do in order to receive your reinforcer, which is the grade. But what you see with fixed ratio schedules is that people, or with like writing a paper, people will put it off and put it off and put it off and put it off and put it off. But the moment you start it, guess what? You tend to finish it, or at least that major section that you're working on. So that's one of the applications that we know about with fixed ratio stuff is that a fixed ratio, when the organism or when the person starts that ratio run, the moment they start responding, they tend to finish. So if you're trying to do something with regard to, and you're finding that you're procrastinating a lot, kind of one of the keys is just give yourself any opportunity to actually start it because you'll likely finish if it's on a fixed ratio schedule. Variable ratio schedules, because you never know when the reinforcer is coming, you don't know how many behaviors you have to do, then that's going to be a strong, steady rate of responding, as we say. Right? The person will be responding quickly, and they will be responding continuously, and they'll be taking very few breaks, if any. A great example of this is the casino. Just go look at people playing a slot machine. They just sit there and they press the button, they press the button, they press the button, they press the button, they don't take many breaks. They just kind of keep pressing the button. So that's the idea there, is that you're on some type of variable ratio schedule. We also have interval schedules. Interval schedules are a rule that's dependent on one behavior, right? But it's dependent on one behavior after a given amount of time, so you're going to get reinforced for that first response after a given amount of time has passed. And so, like a fixed interval schedule, a fixed interval 10, let's say, is that the first response after 10 minutes is going to receive reinforcement. Then again, it only takes one response, but you got to wait that 10 minutes. So what you start to see with the fixed interval schedule is this, it's called a scallop, right? So behavior tends to speed up. You get more behavior the closer you get to that reinforcement interval. Right? So at about 9 minutes, the organism starts responding really fast, whatever that is, whatever we're talking about there. So the kiddo will start looking up at the clock. In fact, you guys all do this, in class. You start looking up at the clock right before class gets out. People start packing up their stuff, those types of things. They do all that right before class gets out, not after class gets out, like they should be doing. All right. Anyway, the point is that your behavior in a classroom is on a fixed interval schedule. One response at the end of that interval will get you reinforced. Getting up or packing up at the end of the class is reinforced. It's not reinforced until the end of the course or the end of the day, lecture, whatever. I guess I was playing around with some of the audio features on this. Anyway, limited hold, pretty straightforward. This ties in with interval schedules. So after a given interval, a response will produce a reinforcer, but it'll only exist for a certain window. Right? So this is like the buffet, breakfast buffet or something like that. The McDonald's breakfast is a classic example of a limited hold. You can make a response, but you've only got a certain amount of time to make it. Right? So it open with 6 a.m. to 10:30 a.m. or whatever it is. So the idea is that there is a hold on that. Duration schedules performing a given behavior for a duration of time, for a period of time. Right? So I think I gave you a bit of an example earlier about working, studying my studying behavior and then that being reinforced by access to the truck. okay, access to working on the truck. So I was using the pre-mat principle, but I was really doing a duration schedule. It was so I would have to study for 1 hour or 2 hour or 3 hours in order to earn my reinforcers. So that's the duration, is that particular thing. It works really well, but you have to have a continuous behavior that you're working with. It can't be a discrete sort of thing. And we already talked about that one, so it must be performed for a given length of time to receive the reinforcer. Right. Now, here's where stuff gets weird, and I told you there's always more to the story when I'm talking about this stuff, so here's where it is, all right? So we're actually going to use reinforcement schedules to decrease behavior. This is odd, because like we said, the definition of reinforcement is to maintain or increase a particular behavior, right? So what we're going to do now is we're going to use reinforcement to actually slow a behavior down. So we're going to be talking about reinforcing different rates of behavior. Okay, so that's the key here. So we can use reinforcement to decrease rates. Reinforcement schedules will maintain behavior at a particular rate. So you can change that schedule and you get a clear effect on behavior. You're still reinforcing. You're not punishing a person or anything like that. It's just that you're saying that what used to take, maybe I used to require 15 responses per week or something like that. Now I'm requiring 4 responses per week. And anything more than that 4 is going to be ignored. And anything less than that 4 is going to be ignored. But I'm going to reduce that behavior from 15 down to 4. Right? Again, it's not punishment. You are not trying to reduce a behavior, so to speak. It's not that contingency sort of thing to reduce that. It's talking about changing the rate of a behavior. You still want the behavior to occur. You're just maintaining it at a different rate. You're not trying to get it down to 0. Okay? So let's look at one of these: differential reinforcement of low rates of behavior. So DRL, differential reinforcement of low rates of behavior. Okay? So the question to you guys: what do we mean by differential? Right? So think about that for a second before you go, pause and pause the video and think about that for a minute. But what we're really getting at here, okay, is that we're going to respond differently. We're going to reinforce differently. Okay? So differential meaning we're waiting for something particular to happen before we reinforce. Okay? That's all we really mean by differential here. Right? So differential. A DRL we can focus on a limited responding situation. So we're going to say a given number of responses is allowed over a time period. Right? So, for example, some people like to participate in class. Right? So some people participate in class at higher rates than other people do. So you can actually maybe you've got somebody that participates too much. So you can put them on a differential reinforcement schedule, a DRL, a low rate or limited responding situations, where you can say, okay, only 2 or 3 comments a day are going to be reinforced. I'm not going to reinforce you if you do any more than 2 comments. Right? So that's your DRL. You're lowering that rate. Right? We can also talk about spaced responding. So you've got that limited responding. We can also pace somebody with this. Responding does not occur for a given amount of time, and then after that period has passed, the first response will be reinforced. So again, what we're thinking about here is that if you make a particular response, I'm not going to let you say anything again. I'm not going to reinforce you. I'm not going to call on you or whatever until 20 minutes has passed. I'm going to slow down that rate of responding. Okay? A lot of kids get really excited and they start going really fast and asking lots of questions and doing all these things. You can start to slow that down using a DRL spaced responding procedure. But again, it's differential reinforcement, so what are you using as the reinforcer? Well, that's up to you. You've got to figure out what's reinforcing behavior and what tools you can use. Like I said earlier, the pre-mat principle is a good one that you can focus on here. But the idea with this is that it's kind of a special type of schedule, right? So you're scheduling reinforcers after a certain number of behaviors. This one's a bit odd, DR0, DRO. There's some argument in the field as to what this really is. Is there such thing as a DR0? And I don't know. Okay, because this starts to violate that rule of contingency when we're thinking about reinforcement. So supposedly, reinforcement, the definition of it that we're using is a contingent application of a stimulus following a behavior, right? Okay, application or removal following a behavior. That requires that you do something. But a DR0 says, we're going to reinforce you if the response does not happen during a given time. So I like to think of this as a reinforcing abstaining behavior. Right? So if you abstain from a response for X amount of time, then I will reinforce you for that. Right? It's a very applicable sort of thing. You can do this really, really, really well, and it works really well with fading and all these other things. Right? But again, if the unwanted behavior happens during the again, we're looking for a behavior not to occur, which is a bit odd. It kind of logically goes backwards here. Okay? If the behavior does happen during the particular interval, that DR0 interval that you're after, then you actually reset the interval. Again, there's the logical problem that we talked about. All right. So what? Again, instead of thinking of this as DR0, you can also think of it as DRO instead of DR0, because really what you're doing is you're just reinforcing any other response. Okay, in a sense. So you're reinforcing other responses other than something other than the one that you don't want. So you're just making sure that one particular thing doesn't happen. That's a bit of an odd thing. And I just mentioned about fading, and here's why. You want to go ahead and start with a very simple success thing here. So the idea is make it easy for them. Right? So if you've got a kid that's talking out of turn, basically tell them that, okay, you need to remain silent for the next 2 minutes. And then earn a reinforcer. And then the next time out, it's 4 minutes, and then it's 8 minutes, and so on and so forth. And you can fade that procedure up to an entire classroom setting. Right? So you're going to change that duration, but you start small to give those early successes, and you can start getting reinforcers. And then once you get reinforcers, behavior starts to maintain, and you can put additional differential requirements on that. This one's useful: differential reinforcement of incompatible responding. So DRI. All right. So the response being reinforced must prevent the undesirable response from occurring. Right? So think about what is incompatible with smoking a cigarette. Right? So if we're wanting to set somebody up on a DRI schedule, what's incompatible with smoking this cigarette? Let's see. Is walking incompatible with smoking? No, probably not. Is talking incompatible? No, probably not. Is studying in a library probably incompatible? Probably. Most libraries you can't smoke in them, so maybe that one works, right? So you're going to reinforce other behaviors that are not the smoking, but they have to be incompatible with it. I think the example I've got up here is swimming. All right. So if you want to maybe reduce somebody's cigarette smoking, encourage them to swim more, right? Because then they're not going to be able to swim, or they're not going to be able to smoke while they're swimming. So it's an incompatible response. In the classroom, my teacher used to do this one all the time with me. Was either I had to sit on my hands because my hands were always messing with my neighbors and flicking my pens and doing all weird stuff. So I either had to sit on my hands, which is incompatible with me punching my neighbor, or do something else like that was incompatible. So the other thing that she would have me do, I'm thinking back to one of my teachers here, was the 4 on the floor thing. You'd be leaning back in your chair and all that stuff. So, and then I'd always fall over and disrupt the class. And so the idea was 4 on the floor. With all 4 feet of the chair on the floor, there's no way for you to be leaning back in the chair. So it's incompatible. Sitting and standing, smoking and swimming, all sorts of good examples there. So differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior. When you got a behavior happening either in yourself or with a kiddo that you do not want, find a behavior to replace it with. Okay, so find a behavior that and that's what we're trying to do, is we're going to reinforce another behavior. So smoking is automatically reinforced by the nicotine. So we're going to try and reinforce something else here, right? And reinforce it at a rate that will eventually replace that smoking. And it's a challenge. This is pretty cool stuff for the classroom. A little harder to use DRI outside of the classroom a lot of times, but it's definitely a useful procedure.
Doesn't that just look lekker? Oh, I
should say DRI.
Makes me thirsty.
DRA is differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, right? So, or alternative responding. So we're going to reinforce anything other than something, right? So it's similar to DRI, but the response doesn't have to be incompatible. It just has to be different, right? So as you saw in the background, I'm going to reinforce you for drinking the water rather than for drinking the beer. They're not completely incompatible. You kind of do both at the same time, but you have 2 glasses supposedly. But the idea is we're going to reinforce the something else, something other than the inappropriate response, or an alternative to those inappropriate responses. So DRA, DRI are some of the most useful procedures you're going to run into in behavior analysis. They're they're used at an unbelievable frequency because they're very effective. We use them in combination with other procedures such as extinction and punishment and timeouts and all that stuff. And we'll talk about how to kind of integrate all these. But the basics here are just that you're going to reinforce something else, you're going to reinforce something incompatible, or you're going to reinforce abstaining. Right. So those are kind of those 3 approaches that we're going to take. And then we're going to apply those at further level as we start to add other, other techniques. So, all right, see you soon.